Perfetto. Io sto aprendo la camera per il Zoom meeting.
Okay.
1971. Those wines from certain vineyards, certain wineries, if held well, if cellared properly, can still be very drinkable now. 1971. I mean, in the book I wrote about Barolo, I tasted in 1971 that a friend of mine's father had made, who passed away, and it was great. It was exceptional. So it just really depends on where they came from. And in 1971, for example, they were starting to produce single vineyard bottlings, but they were still kind of uncommon. They started that in the 60s. Otherwise, it would have been a blend of grapes from different specific vineyard sites. So, you know, where the grapes came from within the area, and how they were grown, and who did it, and it all makes a big difference. But you know, you can really have some tremendous finds and something like that. I mean, it's hard to say with the 1967. You can look at the level of the wine in the bottle and see how much of it is evaporated. The more wine that's missing, the more possibility is of air getting in there and oxidating it. You know, if you've been keeping it well, you know, give it a shot. I wouldn't wait too long, because you don't want to get it when it's really past, and you never know sometimes.
Yeah. I also have a 1970, it's a Nebbiolo d'Alba, and it was from Diano d'Alba, where it came from. So that goes back a ways. And then the other one, I have others, but and one's a Borgono, and I don't remember the vintage on it, but I was thinking it was one of the early 70s, 72. The labels, you know, they get dry and they fall off, and I'm find it in my cellar. It's an interesting bottle. And then the last one I have is Cantina de Marchesi. It's a Barolo 1977. But I thought it'd be kind of fun, since we're talking about Piedmonte, to see some of the older vintages, you know, that go back that far, how they labeled and stuff like that.
Well, I'm sure, you know, if once the COVID passes, we'd all be happy to come over to your house. We'll just pop them over. Do a tasting. Why not?
I'm in.
Very good idea, Alan. I like that.
And I mean, you know, I have to say, we're not, as I mentioned last time, we're really going through specifically wines of the classical portfolio. So, and we're not even talking about vintage, because they change, right, from time to time. So I don't think there's any Marchesi di Barolo there. I know them very well, and that's it's an interesting winery, because that was the original winery of Julia Colbert di Folletti, who married someone of the French noble family, who had to escape during the Revolution, and met someone at the court of Napoleon in one of the Marchese of Barolo, Carlo Tancredi, and they got married. And she's one of the people that's kind of central in the creation of, we think, of the wine we know of as Barolo. So, and that the winery was acquired by another family, the Abono family, quite some time ago, but they didn't have any offspring. So the winery, it was an interesting story, and it's a very historic winery. And they have, you talk about indicating, we should start pretty soon, but indicating vineyards on labels. In the cellar of Marchesi di Barolo, they have bottles of wine that are labeled by hand 1859 and 1861, I believe, and they say Cannubio on them. What Cannubi is a very legendary, iconic vineyard in Barolo. And in fact, people were using that name for a wine made from grapes from that vineyard before Barolo was even created, really. So it was just, you know, that was an iconic vineyard, and of course Barolo was a town, but we'll talk about it a bit. But it was a wine made from grapes within that area, mostly Nebbiolo, but probably some others too. And you know, it was a wine that was really really created intentionally in terms of making a certain style of wine that wasn't really happening before. And a lot of that was because, well, we'll talk when we get to the Barolo section, because otherwise we might not get there.
Yeah, you want to start? I mean, it's 10 past 10.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's get it.
All right, welcome everyone again. Please continue.
So welcome back everybody for our second session of what do we call it? An exploration of the classical portfolio. That's sort of our springboard into the wines of Italy now. Who knows? Maybe we might even do wines of other parts of the portfolio at some other time. But so our second session, we're talking about the area of Piedmont primarily, and another little area attached to it called Valle d'Aosta, which was once considered part of Piedmont, but now it is its own separate regional identity. So just a little recap from last time in case anyone wasn't here for that one. Of course, wine grapes have been grown, and wine has been made in Italy for thousands of years, going back to the native Etruscan peoples, and then Greek settlers that established colonies there, and the ancient Romans that kind of expanded and adopted this sort of viticulture, the culture of growing grapes and making wine. So a very, very ancient tradition, and a very diverse, complex cultural tradition there in Italy, and also as we talked about last time, a very complex growing area in terms of topography and climate, and the number of grape varieties we talked about. So a very, very long history, an important history of growing grapes, grapevines, vitis vinifera, and producing wine from them. Jumping very far forward, the Italian DOC system, Denominazione di Origine Controllata, was created in 1963, based very closely on the French AOC system. And of course, it didn't really do anything new so much other than just sort of systematizing what had been going on for hundreds and even thousands of years. So it created sort of a system and a structure for it, which was then significantly revised in 2009 and 2010, partly to conform to the European community-wide structure for wine, just to make it more consistent as a unity, which is what the EU is theoretically about. And it really stayed pretty much what it was. It just kind of took a different sort of structure, which is this what it looks like in this pyramid now. It's pretty, it's pretty basic. So the bottom half of it is generic wines, just wine, red wine, white wine. A generic wine could theoretically come from grapes grown anywhere in the European community. And then it might say produced a product of France, a product of Italy, or product of any other European country. But the grapes can come from almost anywhere. There's no generic origin as far as the labeling is concerned whatsoever. There might be, but you can't indicate it in that category. There's a second category, a little bit up from that, of generic wines, where you can indicate the vintage if at least 85% of the grapes come from a particular vintage. You can also indicate the grape variety, but only if it is an international grape variety, and not all international grape varieties apply for that. There's about 6 or 7 of them: Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Cabernet Franc, Chardonnay, some others. Pinot Noir is not there for certain reasons, but these are international wines. And I think that they did that. Someone asked me why recently, a student of a course that I'm teaching, but it's not really clear exactly why they did that, except perhaps the fact that Pinot Noir in Italy is called Pinot Nero, just like Pinot Grigio, Pinot Bianco, which are also not considered to be international grapes as far as the generic wine category goes. And Pinot Nero in Italy it might not have originated there, but it has a long history there. I mean, as does Cabernet Sauvignon in some places, but Pinot Nero maybe a little bit more. Pinot Grigio, certainly. Pinot Bianco is also very important. So, but this is a generic category of wines. You know, for us, probably more interesting is what we consider the PGI and PDO section up at the top, which are wines with a geographical indication, meaning that they come from somewhere, that some specific place. And it could be a large place, it could be a regional appellation, or it can be a very, very specific appellation right down to a particular vineyard site. So, and what difference does it make? Well, it has to do with specificity of where the grapes came from to make a particular wine. And that has a huge impact on the character of a given category of wine, and even the category of a particular bottling. We were talking before we started about single vineyard bottlings. We'll talk a lot about that when we're discussing Barolo. So and that's basically the layout of it. For every appellation has a group of a majority producers behind it who petitioned for an appellation for it and kind of control and direct it. It's about promoting the appellation, protecting the integrity of that given wine, defining what it is in very specific qualities. And all of these regulations and parameters of what a particular wine is are put together in what is called the disciplinare, which is kind of like a rule book for any given appellation, and every single appellation has to have one. They're very specific. They leave some leeway for individual producers to express their winemaking philosophy and style, but it has to really conform to what the definition of a particular wine and the appellation is. Talking about the PDO categories, the DOC and the DOCG. Two different categories, you know, it doesn't make a difference. Well, you might find a DOC or even an IGT wine that you really, really like. So it doesn't necessarily, if you have a DOCG, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to like it more or that it's even qualitatively better. The big difference between them is just the rigidity of the regulations that have to be met. So they're much more specific and much more restricted for a DOCG than for a DOC. And a lot of that has to do with lower maximum yields for a DOCG, higher minimum level of alcohol, which used to be an issue. Now, with global warming, the issue is becoming more about how to keep the alcohol level a little bit more controlled and balanced with the other components of the wine. Longer minimum aging, for example, smaller area production, things like that. So does it make a difference? Well, yes and no. I mean, the guarantee, that's what the G stands for, is guarantee that it has a much more specific set of restrictions and guidelines for it, for the use of that category. So let's dive into our wines. So once again, we're really following the classical portfolio, but there's quite a lot of stuff there. So today we're talking about Piedmont, Piemonte. Interesting area. We were talking about that a little bit before. You see where it is. There's Valle d'Aosta just above, just to the north of that. Over on the south, the west of France, on the left-hand side, is France. That's right just west of Piemonte. And France has had a big impact on Piemonte. It was under French rule for a period of time. Most everybody around the 17 and the 1800s and even the early 1900s was speaking French if they were educated. That was really the language of people of a certain class, if you want to say. People who didn't speak French might have spoken Piemontese, which is really a blend of Italian and French. If you speak French, it helps you understand the Piemontese dialect quite a bit. Up to the north there, you see, we talked about it last time, and we also discussed Trentino and Lombardia, Friuli. this just north of the squiggly line, all across the top there are the Alps. So that is definitely one of the boundaries of Piemonte as well, and that's where the name comes from. Foot in the hills and up into the mountains. There's the Ligurian Sea there. The Piemonte is one of the 5 landlocked regions of Italy. So there's a close proximity to the Mediterranean Sea. This part of it is the Ligurian Sea. But it doesn't really have that much influence on the area of Piemonte because of the mountains. And you see, I think you can see my point over here. This is the region of Piedmont. The Alps continue all the way across, of course, to the north and to the east. But so these are the Alps that affect Piemonte, and this is a barrier. This is a barrier that keeps the climate in the area of Piemonte to the south, and also prevents the much more harsher northern temperatures and climate from having too much of an impact there. And the mountains come down and they go all the way around here. These are what are called the Maritime Alps, and then the Ligurian Alps, and then it goes all the way down, and the mountains continue in what are the Apennines, and it goes all the way down the entire peninsula of Italy, creating kind of a division, a backbone, a spine between both sides, the east and the western side of the peninsula. So this is really what kind of topographically what really defines Piemonte, and also Valle d'Aosta to some extent. Here we have, we're starting to talk about wine, of course. Here we have the town of Alba and the town of Asti. These are 2 different provinces. Alba is in the province of Cuneo, and Asti in the province of Asti. We talked about the appellation structure. So Piemonte is a very important wine growing area, both in terms of the prestige of the wines that are produced there, and also the number of them. 42 DOCs, 17 DOCGs, and these are really among the top numbers. There are some areas that have, we'll see them, more DOC appellations, like maybe 64, but less DOCGs. So Piemonte has the highest level of DOCG wines. And interestingly, it has no IGTs. So IGT is not a generic wine. Piemonte doesn't have any of those. But the IGT level is one with a geographic designation, but considered to be on a lower scale in terms of requirements for that. This is what the wine growing areas look like, and where we're going to start is right over here in a small town. Well, actually, it's a big town, perhaps a small city. This is what it looks like. Gavi. So Gavi is a small city, you could call it, south of much, like a lot of the other the wine growing areas of Piemonte. And this is where a wine called Gavi comes from. There is the town of Gavi, and the green part is the wine growing region of Gavi. So in many cases in Italy, you have a place which is sort of thought to be the birthplace of a given wine that gives it its name and the original place where it was produced and maybe became famous. That's how people started calling it Gavi, the wine from Gavi, or it happens in many other cases as well. And then the area growing in production area expands outwards of that. So there are 11 towns that make up the growing zone, the appellation of Gavi, but there's a big distinction between them. If the grapes that are used to make the wine come from within the territory, the township of Gavi, it has a different name. It's called Gavi del Comune di Gavi, and the DOCG level. Other wines would be called Gavi, and at a lower level, and it's less specificity. So this wine is Gavi del Comune di Gavi, DOCG. It's from a winery called Villa Sparina, 100% Cortese grape. And Cortese is what Gavi is all about. Very interesting grape variety. It doesn't really, it's really tied to this area of Piemonte. And this is its big claim to fame. Actually, it makes a very pretty wine of Gavi. And this one comes from the frazione, the hamlet of Gavi called Monte Rotondo. The winery was founded by Mario Macogata in the 1970s and now run by his children. They have a consulting enologist who will talk. His name will come up again. Someone who's kind of made a name for themselves as an enologist and also a wine producer in Piemonte, and some other places as well, Beppe Caviola. Villa Spadina has 70 hectares of vineyard, which is primarily planted to Cortese, but also they also produce Barbera as well. And the soil here is very interesting. It's primarily clay and marl, but it has, what really makes it a little bit different, I think, is the alluvial deposits, which are material, of other types of rocks, mostly stones that are carried down in rivers and deposited. So they make for a very kind of looser, gravelly soil, and because they come from somewhere else, they create I wouldn't say a really complex soil perhaps, but it has a very sort of distinctive character to it. And this is mixed with the other clay and marl that was already there. This is the Mocogata family. And you see the bottle is very, it's a very interesting bottle that, it's kind of unusual. Many people do it, but it still is kind of unusual for people to design their own sort of bottle shape. And this one was based on what is said to be an ancient bottle that was found in the farmhouse. So they've been making wine and even bottling wine there for quite a long time in the under the Villa Spadina estate. So I don't know how many of you have had agave de agave. They tend to be a simple, a fairly simple, light to medium bodied wine, very fresh, the Cortese grape, if handled well, keeping the yields contained. Has a really nice. It's simple, it's straightforward, but has a very nice personality to it. Kind of soft, a little minerally, kind of muted fruits. So you don't get a lot of this bright citrus, but it's round and it's soft. And this is a particularly compelling version of it, partly because it comes from this area of Gavi de Gavi, Monte Rotondo. And so, it's a little bit, I would say, above many of the Gavis that we find out in the market. So if you haven't tried it, try agave, preferably one from Villa Spadina if you can. And I'm sure you can certainly find it in your market. Moving on to Asti. Now, everybody, I think, will be familiar with the name of Asti. It's an important wine town. From its own, it is also what we call the provincia. So it's the provincial capital of the province of Asti. Kind of a long-time competitor in some ways with Alba, just like Florence and Siena were sort of, kind of in competition for quite a while. So Asti DOCG, let's take a look at the category overall. Made from 100% Moscato Bianco, which it turns out is Piemonte's most widely planted white grape variety. We'll talk about Piemonte's most widely planted red grape variety shortly as well. By volume, however, it's the biggest appellation of Piemonte, 80 plus million bottles from one particular appellation. That's quite a lot. The growing area consists of 50 villages in 3 different provinces. Most of them are in Asti. There are some in Cuneo, and that's very interesting. There are some part of the Asti wine growing area officially is in the province of Cuneo, and even in some towns that also are part of the Roero appellation or the Barolo appellation. So, but not too much. And then there's even fewer towns in the province of Alessandria, neighboring Asti. Most of the area, certainly most of the area of Asti, where Moscato is grown in this particular kind of soil called terre bianche. It's a white soil, that's its name. It's a fairly shallow soil on top of bedrock, but the soil itself is alternating layers of white sand with sandstone and calcareous limestone marls. And there tend to be a lot of marine fossils and as well as some calcium carbonate. So, I mean, that's the growing area. Now, in Cuneo, for example, the soil tends to be a little bit different. They might plant Moscato that might have been included in the appellation because it has a little bit of terre bianche, maybe more sand and things like that. But that really has makes a big impact on the Moscato grape and the wine that's made from it. But within this category of Asti, there are two different wines. Same wine, same appellation, but very different types of wine. The first is called Asti DOCG. This is, gets back to labeling, but this does really have distinguish between two different things that have a big impact on the wine itself. So it really makes a different wine. The first is Asti DOCG, which is a fully sparkling wine, meaning about 5 to 6 atmosphere pressure in the bottle. So 6 atmosphere pressure is typical for Champagne. 5 is typical for most Prosecco Spumante and Trento Doc, Franciacorta, although there are some Franciacorta that are a little bit lower, around 4. So this is a fully sparkling wine, and therefore you need to have a mushroom cap with a mushroom cork with a cage to close it. The alcohol level typically is around 7 to 9%. The vintage, it can bear vintage if you like, minimum 85% grapes from that stated year. And the people that produce Asti are mostly large commercial producers. Then the other one is Moscato d'Asti, DOCG. So what's the difference? Both made from 100% Moscato Bianco from the same growing area. Here, the big difference has to do with, one, pressure. So here it has a lower pressure in the bottle. It's a maximum 2.5 atmosphere, which is considered in Italy to be frizzante. In other areas like Champagne, when they could use the term, they had to abandon it. They made a trade-off with another to kind of keep a monopoly on the term of method champenoise. So there you used to call it crémant. Crémant means creamy. It was softer bubble. Not quite as bubbly and aggressive and prickly sometimes. A little bit softer, lighter bubble. And because of that, this one has a normal cork. What is in Italy is called a tappo a raso. So it's a regular cork in the bottle. Even lower amount of alcohol, 5 to about 5.5. It has to be vintage dated. And this one can be made in the classic method. That is the second fermentation in bottle, which of course is how Moscato was born. That's how they were making Moscato wines before the invention of the Martinotti method, which is better known as the Charmat method, which was invented in Asti by someone named Federico Martinotti, who was working at the one of the earliest wine experimentation institutes there, which is still there, who developed, instead of conducting the second fermentation in the bottle, who devised a method of conducting the second fermentation in large pressurized tanks and then bottling it. So it's exactly the same process of the second fermentation, but instead of doing it in individual bottles, he invented a way of doing it in a much larger vessel, which became a stainless steel tank later on when that technology was invented. So, and there are some people who are still making Moscato d'Asti, DOCG, in the classic method, second fermentation in the bottle, but very rare. Most of them are also made in autoclave. Very interestingly, we talk about making sparkling wines that by having them undergo a second fermentation. Well, you can do that in certain places. They make a still wine. Maybe they hang on to it for a while. They let it, and then they do a very clear second process to make it sparkle by adding sugar and yeast to it, and in putting it in a closed container, whether it be a bottle or a big tank under pressure, but it's closed. You can do exactly the same thing as is done with most Asti in a continuous production process. So you do the primary fermentation in a large stainless steel tank, but you leave the top open. And you have to do that, otherwise it'll explode. So in any fermentation process, if you're doing it in a stainless steel container, you can't have it full and completely closed, because the second fermentation creates a lot of carbon dioxide and it would just blow it off. So, I mean, it would explode. So the first fermentation, the alcoholic fermentation, is always done with air contact. So otherwise it'd be very dangerous. In this case with Asti, they start it like that. And then in many cases, they'll just let it, once it reaches a certain level of alcohol, desirable alcohol, 5%, maybe 6% for an Asti, they'll stop it. They'll close it. They won't stop the fermentation. They'll just put a cap on the vessel and allow the second fermentation, or allow the fermentation to continue, but in a closed container, which traps the carbon dioxide inside. That's how Asti is made. So most of it is made in a large tank using a continuous fermentation process, from the alcoholic fermentation straight into the presa de spuma, the part to make the bubbles, to create the carbon dioxide gas trapped in the wine, which makes the bubbles. So here's from Gavi over on the southern part there. We're going to go over to, the eastern part. The southern part. We're going to go over to Asti in the north. And we have 3 Astis. I'm pointing, so this is a map of the Moscato growing area. You see these other 2 parts here. This is in Santa Vittoria d'Alba, which is in the Roero. We'll see where that is a little bit later on. And then the other part here is in Serralunga d'Alba, which is part of the Barolo area. I'm pointing out these 2 towns here. You see Colosso and Castiglione Tinella, because that's where 2 of the Astis we're going to look at come from specifically. So here are the three Astis. These are all Moscato d'Asti, DOCG, so all made in the second version of production that we were discussing. The first 2 come from, as I pointed out, Colosso and Castiglione Tinella, which is really right in the sort of classic area of Moscato production in Asti, and both of them have this typical terre bianche. And you see 5% alcohol, 1.7 atmosphere. So very, at least the Viberti, I couldn't find data on the Scagliola, but at least in the Viberti, a very sort of soft mousse, which I find very, very appealing. And low alcohol, which you retain obviously the sweetness, but also the beautiful floral character of Moscato. And when we drink Moscato, at least the sparkling Moscato, we're not drinking it for the alcohol. We're drinking it for the friendly, pretty, delicious character of the Moscato Bianco grape itself. The third one from Stefano Farina is interesting because they're based in the town of Diano d'Alba. Somebody mentioned that town before. Diano d'Alba is one of the 11 authorized villages for Barolo. Its real claim to fame is actually dolcetto. They make a great dolcetto from Diano d'Alba on a DOCG level. So very different soil. primarily. I mean, climate-wise, not all that different, maybe a little bit higher in altitude, but what really makes a big difference here is the soil, limestone and calcareous clay, as opposed to this terre bianche soil, very loose and sandy. There's some information about the winery. They have, interestingly, they have a number of different estates. So they have two in the Langhe area and others in Piemonte, and then they also do something in Tuscany and Puglia. Going back to Scagliola, this is a typical family winery that was founded in 1936, and I think now they're in their third or fourth generation, but really kind of typical family activity, as is Viverti. We'll look at them later because we'll talk more about that winery when we get into some of the other wines. Okay, now we're moving over now into the area of the Langhe. And Langhe, what is it? It's an area. It's not really an official area in terms of, it's not like a province or a town or anything like that. It's an area, and there's Langhe as we call it. There's also Alto Langhe, which is the high part of Langhe, where Nebbiolo doesn't grow. There's a lot of skiing up there. They're making a classic method sparkling wine there from Pinot Nero and Chardonnay. So here we're talking about the Langhe area, and it gets a little tricky because the Langhe refers to a geographical area, not always very, very sharply defined. It's also an appellation. We'll take a look at that. But what I want to point out right now is here you see Langhe. Here you see Roero, which is another important wine growing area. And here you see the Tanaro River, which comes up from the south and goes all the way over here, and then really becomes the dividing line between these two areas, Roero and Langhe. And in fact, in the Langhe, they refer to Roero as L'altro fiume, the other side, L'altro Tanaro, the other side of the river for them. They don't even say the name. Some people have a hard time saying Roero. It is the name of 100% Nebbiolo wine that is made in that area, and it's a great wine growing area. They haven't quite found their identity yet, even though it's an old wine growing area. But where it gets a little tricky is we'll see that these appellations kind of overlap. So we're going to talk first about, let's see, what are we going to talk first about? Yes, the Langhe. Okay, we're going to talk first about the Langhe area. So the Langhe area is this big green area. And the big green area incorporates all of this other stuff because it's just, this is all part of the Langhe. And if you look really closely there, you can see that there's a green line that follows all the way around here. So it's a very large appellation, which is mostly in the Langhe, but a significant portion of it is also in the Roero. So, sometimes names don't necessarily follow specific geographical boundaries. Just like Asti is not only made in the province of Asti or in the area of Asti, it's also made in the Roero and in parts of the Langhe. So welcome to Italy. So here is the Langhe, and it is also, besides an area, as I mentioned, it's an appellation. What kind of appellation is it? It's a big appellation. What we're going to talk about right now, and we'll talk about some other types of Langhe, is the Langhe Arnese. So Arnese is a name of a grape variety that is really native to on the other side of the Tanaro River in the Roero area. And this is where the grape variety was discovered, really on the verge of extinction. Only a few kind of a handful of sporadic vines remaining in the area. Many people maybe had them, but they didn't even know what they were. Two people are really kind of credited with saving the grape variety and making wine from it and kind of putting it on the map and having other people start to do it as well. Alfredo Corrado Vietti, an old friend of mine who unfortunately passed away some years ago. and Bruno Chicosa from Barbaresco, who are really some of the two of the champions of this particular grape variety, and started making wine from it. And now it's a DOCG from the Roero area. There's also, it is also approved, the grape variety is approved for the Langhe area, along with many other grapes, and we'll see some others of them. So you can make a Langhe Arnés from Arnés grapes grown in the larger area of the Langhe. And here it's very interesting. Let's see. So Cordero de Montezemolo, we'll see. This is a very interesting bottling of it, because there's, of course, it's 100% Arnés, as it must be, from 3 different sites. 2 of them are in the Roero. So they have vineyards in the Roero where they grow Arnés in the typical growing areas for Arnés. And one of them is in La Morra in the Langhe. So here you really have a blend of Arnés grapes partly from the soils of the Roero area, the classic wine growing area for Arnés, and some also from the Langhe. And the difference is a little bit, the Roero is a much younger soil. There's more sand in it. The topography is a little bit different. They don't really have these Langhe, the extended tongues of earth that they do in the Langhe section. So a very interesting combination of these 2 areas. It spends 3 months on the fine lees. So after the fermentation is complete, they leave it in the tank and just allow the lees to settle, but remain in contact with the wine for 3 months, which just gives it a very subtle kind of creaminess and additional body, but very subtle. There's no wood on the wine at all, which is typical for Arnés, because what you really want is the freshness, the fruitiness, the crispness, and the very distinct, pretty aroma, kind of floral, kind of old, herbal, pressed flower petals and things like that. So very nice, and I would say compelling version of that. Now moving along, we'll see Cordero de Montezemolo again later, as we will. We're overlapping a lot of different wineries because we're going sort of category by category and comparing them when we can, when there's more than one in the category. Now we're going to talk about 2 other appellations, Alba versus Dogliani. And here's we're really talking about Barbera in this case. Let's see. No, we're talking, of course, my arrow got a little bit off kilter there. So here we're talking about Dolcetto d'Alba and Dogliani. So you can see 2 very different areas. They're both fairly large, but we have Dolcetto d'Alba and Dogliani. So what's the difference? Same grape variety. Let's take a look first at the Dolcetto d'Alba from Cantina Viberti. So we already saw Viberti once. We'll see them a few more times. So Dolcetto, a little bit about that. It's the first of the red grapes to ripen in the area. It's a very fruit-driven wine, medium body for the most part. Red cherry color, fresh forward fruit. I hope many of you have had it. They're great wines. They're overlooked wines. They're undervalued wines. Maybe partly because it's overshadowed by other wines like Barbera, which generally has more body and intensity and structure to it, and certainly by Barolo. So, but Dolcetto is the wine that people in Barolo drink every day and always have. And in fact, Dolcetto, for that reason, was much more popular than Barolo, although Barolo was certainly more prestigious, more important, but that's not what people drank all the time. Sometimes they just put it up as a trophy on their mantelpiece, and you still see many of them there. Don't do that. Drink them. So, moderate alcohol for the most part, although it's going up now. This is what everybody drank. The good thing is it also grows in places where Nebbiolo can't, at a little bit higher altitude. So then we go to the Doliani DOCG. It used to be called Dolcetto di Doliani, but in 2011, the consortium decided to change the name because they really wanted to focus more on the place of origin rather than the grape variety that they probably felt, with good reason, that people looked down upon it. They thought, oh, Dolcetto must be sweet. It's a what do they call it? Diminutive, dolcetto, the little sweet one. So it's not sweet unless you sweeten it. But it's sweeter than Nebbiolo is because it ripens earlier. It ripens first. So this grape is sweet when all the others are very dry and bitter. A very interesting growing area. Luigi Einaudi is really one of the most prominent wineries of Doliani. They have significant holdings in Doliani, but also in the Langhe. We'll see some of their other wines. They have some of the really great vineyards of Dolcetto in the Doliani area. Quite high, 350 meters above sea level. They have, some of them are these vineyards, San Giacomo, San Luigi, old vines planted in 1937, 1941. They also make a superiore version, which requires additional aging, lower yields. So, I mean, really, if you can come across that one, well, Einaudi, well, you can come across all of these wines. Einaudi is a great producer, and I would actually advise you to, if you can, get a Dolcetto d'Alba and a Doliani and compare them side by side. If you're having it with food, have the Dolcetto with pasta and the Doliani with a structured, grilled or steak or roast poultry. Great, both excellent wines. Here's another Alba appellation. This is the Barbera d'Alba. So Barbera is the most widely planted grape in Piemonte. It is considered to be native to Piemonte, very popular once again. It is much more accessible than the important Vini dal Regalo, that's what they're called, Barolo. So it's typically a wine that people would save. They would save some bottles from one of their children's birth years and hold on to them, or they would give a bottle to an important person, a priest or a lawyer or a doctor, something like that. So Barbera is another one of the drinking wines, very, very popular in the area. The difference between Barbera and Dolcetto is it has a little bit more body, a little bit more color, anthocyanins to it that give it a darker color, more kind of rich palate texture. There are two principal growing areas, Asti, and this is the most important red grape of Asti. It grows in this particular Terre Bianche soil, but also Terre Rosse. The Asti, generally speaking, is a little bit lighter bodied than the Alba because of the soil, once again. So two kind of different expressions of the Barbera grape, and here too there is a superiore version which requires some aging to it. So let's take a look at the wines. Once we have again Stefano Farina from Diano d'Alba, Viberti, whose winery is up in the Barolo area. Caviola, which is once again Beppe Caviola, the consulting enologist of Villa Sparina, and Michelino e Figlio Veglio from Diano d'Alba. So really interesting. I think here all of these wines are 100% Barbera. None of these are superiore, so they're not really, about aging and developing structure per se. However, the Caviola, it's not bottled as a superiore, but I don't believe. But it does spend 12 months in large casks, so the impact of any wood flavoring is minimal. what you get here is the oxidation, the slow oxidation over a period of time of being in a wood container, which allows the wine to breathe as it is maturing in the vessel. Here there's, with the Stefanofarina, 12 months in French barrique. And now, so here, these are smaller barrels from select forests. So that is definitely going to have an impact on the wine. I haven't tasted the wine, but here the big difference with small barrels like that is the toast. How much are they? How high is the toast? And what is the percentage of new barrels versus ones that have been used before? So very different. Also should say that that the Caviola uses what is called ambient yeast fermentation. So there's no inoculation. There's no yeast that is introduced to start the fermentation. Just what's floating around in the air. And what impact does that have on the wine? Very controversial. We won't get into that right now. And I should say too, for the Barbera d'Alba, the minimum required is 85% Barbera. You could blend up to 15% of other approved grape varieties for the area, but none of these producers do. These are all 100% Barbera, and that's not unusual. Now we're going to compare, we're getting into Nebbiolo grape. We'll compare Alba versus the Langhe area, because there are two different appellations for the Nebbiolo grape variety, besides others like Barolo and Roero. So what is the difference between Nebbiolo d'Alba and Langhe Nebbiolo? Here you see the Nebbiolo d'Alba appellation, a little bit smaller. Then we talked about the Langhe appellation. So this is a Langhe Nebbiolo. So here you have Nebbiolo d'Alba that comes first. The other one is the Langhe DOC. And if you have at least 85% of one of the approved grape varieties, you can put the name Nebbiolo on the label after the term Langhe DOC. So it's a different spin on that. The big difference here is that Nebbiolo d'Alba has to be 100%. We'll compare them. Let's see. Well, let's go back a second. So we'll compare them. But one of the big differences is that Nebbiolo d'Alba must be 100% Nebbiolo. Langhe Nebbiolo only needs to be 85% Nebbiolo. However, many of the people that make it will use 100% Nebbiolo for the Langhe Nebbiolo. One of the reasons for that is that unlike the Nebbiolo d'Alba, Langhe Nebbiolo can be made from Nebbiolo grapes from the Barolo area, because you see that the Barolo area is within the area of the Langhe, but the Nebbiolo d'Alba appellation, if you want to call it Nebbiolo d'Alba, you're not using any grapes from the Langhe area. So that is a big distinction. And the difference there is that you have many producers in the Barolo area who make a Langhe Nebbiolo, 100% Nebbiolo, from grapes that they choose not to use for their Barolo for one reason or another. We can talk about some of those. The Langhe Nebbiolo is the most prestigious grape, we could say, although it's not the most widely planted. What the difference between that and, say, Barbera, it has a much paler color. It has more tannins. It has much higher acidity, and it gives more structure and focus to the wine. It's an early budding variety and late ripening. So so Dolcetto is the first, then comes Barbera and Nebbiolo about the same time. It buds pretty early, but it is the last variety to be harvested, which gives it a long growing period. And we think it comes to the name Nebbiolo. It goes by other names in other places, in Piedmont and Lombardia and Valle d'Aosta. But we think here the name Nebbiolo comes from the fog. When the fog returns is often when the Nebbiolo is still hanging, and often people are picking it in the fog when it reaches its full maturity, its full potential. Nebbiolo is very, very site sensitive, and the site sensitivity is demonstrated even more in the Barolo appellation, because the yields are by law much lower, and the growing area is much more restricted. So it comes from a much more defined growing area and lower yields. So here we get to compare a little bit. There are 5 different wines. We have 3 Langhe Nebbiolos in the middle, compared to 1 Nebbiolo d'Alba on the left, and a very interesting wine, a Langhe appellation, Langhe Rosso, on the right. So let's just take a quick look at those. Now the requirements, if you look across the top bar for the first 4, the requirements are, as I mentioned, 100% for Nebbiolo d'Alba, minimum 85% for Langhe Nebbiolo. However, all 3 of the producers here choose to use 100% Nebbiolo grapes. Then we get to, we come to the important factor of where the grapes, the Nebbiolo grapes, come from. They go into these wines. So in the case of Monchiero, their Nebbiolo grapes come from a frazione, a little town called Scaparone d'Alba, right near the Tanaro River, and it's just on the right side, the Langhe side of the Tanaro River. So it has a lot of the same soil, this kind of alluvial soil, a little bit looser, sandier soil, very similar to the soil just on the other side of the Tanaro River in the Roero area. So that makes a huge difference on that. And how does it differ? Well, the soil, you can taste it. And I would really advise you to taste Monchiero Nebbiolo d'Alba against one of the other 3, because in here, the big difference is going to be where the grapes come from and what kind of soil and environment they're growing in. For the Einaudi, their grapes come from a vineyard in Neve, which is in the Barbaresco area. But then they're using 2 of these grapes from Nebbiolo grapes from 2 of these very old Dolcetto vineyards, primarily in the area of Doliani, very high altitude, and they have planted Nebbiolo grapes at the lower part of these altitudes, because at a higher level, Nebbiolo just won't grow. But very interesting growing area, because it's much higher than most of the other areas in the sort of the lower part of the Langhe where Barolo, Nebbiolo for Barolo grows. And so that's a question of altitude. And you also have the soil there. It's a little bit, it's more compact, it's rockier as well as high. The Cordero de Montezemolo use Nebbiolo grapes all from the Langhe, from the Barolo area, from La Morra and Casanefolletto. And as does Viberti, but their grapes come from different places within the Barolo growing area. They all use all from Tortonian soils. We'll talk about that shortly and find out what that really means. But they come from vineyards located, and it's a number of different vineyards located in Barolo, of course, Verduno, very, very interesting town in the Barolo area. Not completely within the Barolo area, but about half of the township. And from a very interesting area called Perno, which is now part of Monforte. It used to be its own separate little town with this separate little castle, if there is such a thing. And great growing area. So it would even be great to taste all 3 of those Langhe Nebbiolos side by side, and you can then really see the impact of what we call terroir. The vinification regimen is a little bit different, but that's not really what it's about. It's more about where the grapes come from. Then we go to the 5th one there from our our now friend Stefano Farina, Langhe Rosso. What does that mean? Langhe Rosso is a wine that can be made from any of the approved red grape varieties for the Langhe appellation. And there are a lot of them. I think 15 or 16 at last count. This one is the classic combination. They kind of gave this was like the original Langhe Rosso, a blend of Nebbiolo and Barbera. Why? It makes perfect sense. I mean, Barbera gives the dark color, the body, the fruit forwardness, and Nebbiolo gives it structure, tannin, and acidity. It's like kind of a marriage made in heaven. And many people planted Nebbiolo and Barbera in the same vineyard, and they would just harvest them together and make a wine from it. It's a great combination. So, and then there are many different other Langhe Rossos, and it's hard to really, but this is sort of the classic combination, the marriage, let's say. So now we're getting into climbing up the pyramid there. Let's take a look at Barolo versus Barbaresco, both in the Langhe area, both made from 100% Nebbiolo grapes. The Barolo area is a little bit bigger. It consists of 11 different townships, only 3 of which are completely inside the growing area, and 5, but there are 5 principal villages. We'll see a map very soon. In Barbaresco, it's a smaller area. There are only 3 towns that make up the growing area, a little bit in Alba too. Both of them have different sort of subcategories. And basically, Barbaresco ages a little bit less. It's 2 years for a regular bottling with at least 18 months in wood, compared to and 3 years for a Reserva, compared to 3 years minimum for a regular Barolo or classic Barolo. Some people call it like normale, but now we like to use the term classic because it's not normal, it's just not Reserva. And 5 years for the Reserva bottling. There are 181 MGAs in Barolo and 74 in Barbaresco. We'll talk about what an MGA is. Here's a big difference in the soil makeup. Once again, Barolo consists of soil from 2 different geological ages, whereas most of Barbaresco comes from one of them. And climate-wise, Barolo is really considered to be a continental climate, whereas and as is Barbaresco, but Barbaresco it's closer to the Tanora River, which has a little bit more of a moderating influence on the wine growing area because it's much closer. The big difference in topography is the Langhe, what we call where the name of the area comes from. I'll show you a topographical map in a second so you can see what I'm talking about. But the Langhe comes from a Piemontese word, lenge, which probably comes from a French word, langue, which means tongue. And because these are like what we call in geographical wine speak, either hogbacks or cuestas, depending on if they're kind of double-sided or more single-sided, a steeper slant on one side and a more gentle one on the other. But these are like long spits of earth that start at a higher level and then kind of taper down, and they tend to be kind of narrow. It's hard to, you can see it if you're familiar with the areas. You can see the difference between the morphological difference between the 2 growing areas. But I mean, basically, they don't have these long extended hill chains in Barbaresco that you find in Barolo. You find some of them in Barbaresco, but not quite as distinctive. So you get a lot of steep hills and slopes, but not as much of these sort of configurations. In terms of the wine, generally speaking, Barolo tends to be a much more structured. People used to call it like masculine wine. Whereas Barbaresco was considered to be a more aromatic sort of with more feminine wine with more finesse and lighter body, but more kind of aromatic aroma. those are generalizations. Maybe it's maybe it's a starting point is fine, but then you take somebody like Bruno Giacosa in Barbaresco, who makes Barbarescos that are very, very structured and intense. So it's not black and white, certainly. So looking at the Barbaresco area, here we have 3 different Barbarescos. 2 of them are from the same producer. We have another Stefano Farina, who is Indiano d'Alba, but has vineyards in Barbaresco. Then there are 2 from Fontana Bianca. So what's the difference between them? It has to do with site specificity. This one is what we call an MGA. We're going to find out what that really means now. Called Bordini. So they come from a specific registered sub area, which is referred to as now they used to call it cru. Now we call it MGA, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But before we do that, I'm kind of holding off on that because I wanted to tell you, talking about Barolo and Barbaresco, where it came from. So we're not going to get into the history. It's a great story. We talked a little bit about Marchesi di Barolo initially, Giulia Folletti di Colbert, who she and some other, well, she was credited with being one of the originators of it, probably more Count Benso di Cavour in Gonzane Cavour, who hired one of the Savoia, a general in the Savoia forces, who was also an enologist and to improve his vineyard estate there, who was called over by Carlo Alberto, the king of the Savoia, to revamp the royal wineries in Polenzo, and he also had a castle in Verduno. So I mean, and this is when these wines, when Barolo and when this type of winemaking was really created in the area of Piemonte in around 1859, 1860, 1861, along with the reunification of Italy. Whole story in and of itself, and a fascinating story. So they've been making this wine for a long time, but it was never really, it took a while for the growing area to really be defined, and for people to, for the knowledge and the techniques that were developed by these people to be diffused. And so there was in modern times, there was a consortium, a group, an unofficial group of producers who got together in 1934. Okay, that is post World War I, post international economic depression. Remember that the French AOC system was not created until 1936. The Italian DOC system was not created until 1963. So these people got together out of their own initiative to really try to define and protect and promote this wine, whatever it was. The first official Barolo and Barbaresco appellations came out in 1968. So they were among the first. The first were in 1966, but it took a little bit of time to sort of get the disciplinare, all the rules together. And now these vineyards, we talk about cru, we're going to talk about MGA. This is nothing new. These, Renato Ratti was one of the first people to kind of actually map them, these classic historic vineyard sites that had been around for hundreds of years. I was doing some research, and in my town of Castelnifolletto, they have what is called a cadaste, or actually 3 of them, which are deed books. And I took photographs of every single page of them, and their earliest one dated back to 1864, 1866, I believe. A lot of it was written in French. It's all written by hand. There's one in La Mora, which is much older, 1500s. And they were using the names of many of the vineyard sites that are now what we call MGAs. Back then, they were identified already. Were they making wines from single vineyard bottling wines from them? No. But the vineyard sites were already known and appreciated. And Renato Ratti was one of the first to really kind of codify it on a map, but it was not official. It was really only in 2009 and 2010, as I mentioned, that they sort of registered and officialized all this stuff. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not so much for the better. We'll talk about maybe one or two examples of that. So here is, you see the map of Barolo on the right. On the left, you see a graphical map of the exact same area. And if you look around here, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. These sort of lange, these spits of earth that go off from a central spine. Then you have these larger ones that tend to go up there. And then you have these lateral sections that go off of that.
Alan,
So,
are you going to share your screen and show that map, or should I be looking?
You don't see the screen?
No.
Well,
I can see it. Is anyone else having an issue with it?
I can see it.
okay, I just want to make sure because I don't want to, I mean, I hope everybody can see it. It should, I see it. And it says I'm screen sharing. So maybe you need to reboot your system.
Yeah, we can see it, Alan.
Okay.
Okay, let me, I'll switch, get out of this full screen mode.
All right. So,
There it is.
here's the topographical version of it. And this is like the classic, you can see it from the sky. You can see it when you're there. They go off in all different directions. The main ones go from the north to the south. And by that, I mean, they start in the north and then like right here. And then this one goes up and it goes higher in altitude. And then like the same thing here. This is the road from, this is Brunzane Cavour. This is basically the road to Alba. So this is flat here. I used to drive this every day. And then you go up the road here, Casonifoletto, and then you're going up this whole thing, but while you're up a spine towards Monforte, but going off of that to the west and to the east, you have these other lateral spits of land, lange. And this is where the grapes are grown. And this makes this really distinguishes this wine growing area over any others. And, you know, you see some of that in Barbaresco too, but not quite to this extent. I mean, Barbaresco is part of the Langhe. So, okay, so we have 11, as I mentioned, 11 different townships, 2 different geological ages. There are 2 different geologic ages that really created these areas or had a big impact on these 2 different areas. One of them is, and there's a line, a dividing line there, but there's no sharp dividing line. It's a kind of approximate because they overlap a little bit right in the middle, around Casonifoletto and some other places. But on the western side, it's mostly of Tortonian origin. On the right side is mostly of Serravaglian origin. In Italy, they still like to use the term Alveziano, which doesn't exist anymore in the geology world, but they're attached to it. Helvetian, but it doesn't really exist. But Alveziano is basically Serravaglian. Now it's really known as Serravaglian. The big difference here is that Serravaglian is an older soil, so it tends to be more compact. And it has a lot of sand, but it's more compressed, compact sand. Whereas the Tortonian is a younger geological age by a few million years. In geologic times, it doesn't really mean that much, but it's significantly different. It's a younger soil. It's compact also, but it's more fertile. It has more density to it. Some places have a lot of lime and. So very different soils. And another big distinction between them is that most of the vineyard sites in the eastern side look west. Most of the better sites for Nebbiolo, for Barolo, whereas in the western side, most of the better sites look towards the east. And if you see here, this you can see my pointer, right? I hope this place right here, this sort of lange, is Kanubi. And you can see that this one has two expositions, one looking towards the east and one looking towards the west. So those are, two big distinctions there. So there are 11 townships, 5 principal towns, only 3 of them are located within zones. So the ones that are completely within there, Barolo, Castione-Folletto, and Setolunga. The other 2 that we consider to be principal towns, important towns, Monforte and La Mora. Of course, they're all important, but these are really the principal Barolo growing areas. So now we're going to start with our classic Barolo. So these are blends, and Barolo is typically a blend of Nebbiolo grapes from different vineyard sites and different towns in many cases. Which is also true of, there's nothing inherently better or worse of a classic Barolo compared to a single vineyard Barolo. In fact, some people could make a case like Bartolo Mascarello, for example, has never made a single vineyard Barolo. They make a Barolo as a blend of 3 different vineyard sites, because the argument for that is that you get Nebbiolo grapes from different vineyard sites that demonstrate different characteristics, and you blend them together and you make a wine which is much more balanced. So some vineyards, we'll talk about a few of them, will give you more muscular, more structured tannic wines from the grapes, and others will give you wines that are softer, more aromatic, and with kind of more delicacy and finesse. And so if you blend them together, you have a more balanced wine. I mean, you can't argue against that. This is what is typically done in Champagne. Now you will find some single vineyard Champagnes, but was very unusual up until not that long ago. This is also what was the norm in Burgundy. Everybody knew the different growing areas and the characteristics of the different individual vineyards, but most people blended them together. You had people that, merchants that would go and buy wines or buy grapes from different areas to blend them. That was a norm. So we have 5 here. And here, once again, these have to be 100% Barolo. That is, 100% Nebbiolo for both Barolo and Barbaresco. Where do they come from? Even in a classic Barolo, a blend. So the ones from Caviola come from the vineyard, the town of Novello, which is adjacent to Barolo, in an area that's called Sotto Castello. It's an MGA. It's located under the castle, but this is not bottled. There's a single vineyard bottling. It's just where he happened to source grapes. Stefano Farina makes a Barolo from 3, he says, they say 3 of the different biotypes of Nebbiolo. Well, they're considered to be biotypes. Lampia, which is the most predominant one. Miquette, which is actually a virus version of Lampia, but no one knew that until they could analyze the genetics. It was different. It looked different. The bunches are much smaller, and there are fewer of them. And it actually, for people that made wine from those grapes, it made a superior wine because there was a smaller yield. And there's another variety of Nebbiolo called Rosé that people thought was Nebbiolo Rosé. Well, guess what? It's not really Nebbiolo. It's a different, genetically speaking, different grape variety. a lot of genetics in common with Nebbiolo, but it's different. Now, if you acquire Rosé clones from a nursery, supposedly they are a type of Nebbiolo. They removed anything that was not genetically part of Nebbiolo. I don't really believe it, but and the old wine, any old vines of Rosé that are there are grandfathered. So but it's interesting if Stefano Farina combines these 3 types of Nebbiolo in one wine. That would be very interesting. There are some other people that do that as well. Cantina Veglio Michelino e Figlio. You have to specify because Valio is a very common name, as is Viberti and a number of others in the area. So here, Valio makes a Barolo from Serralunga and Diano d'Alba. They're very close together. These are clearly on the Serravaglian side. Barolos from Serralunga typically give wines that are they're kind of muted. They're potent. They need a long time to come around. They're not that expressive initially, but a lot of structure. It just takes time for it to come out. And most of the vineyards in Serralunga, certainly most of the great ones, face west, southwest, and west. Viberte makes their flagship wine is called Buon Padre. I'll show you some information about their winery when we get into the single vineyard wines. They make a Barolo from vineyards in Vernier, which is a frazione, hamlet of Barolo, where their winery is located. Other vineyards in the town of Barolo, as well as Novello, Verduno, and Monforte. So here, once again, we have a blend. Monforte is over in the sort of Italian side, much more kind of concentrated, full-bodied wines that kind of benefit by some aging time. Barolo, Novello, Verduno tend to make wines. Yeah, they will benefit with age, but they have much more kind of delicacy and finesse to them, generally speaking. Then there is the wine of Einaudi. And Einaudi is, as I mentioned, it's a historical winery. They started purchasing vineyards in the Barolo area. They were quite well known for Dolcetto, but I'll tell you a story when we get to their other single vineyard wines. But this is a blend of grapes from the iconic vineyard that I mentioned earlier, Canubi, as well as Terlo and Barolo, Busia and Monforte, which is another one of these real Serravaglian muscular growing areas, and one that I'm very familiar with. As well as Monvidiero, which was one of the most distinctive vineyards in the town of Verduno. And once again, I really think that these are the real distinguishing factors between these wines. And this is something that I think you would be able to taste in the wines, especially if you were doing a comparative tasting. So now here is a story behind these things that are now called MGAs. Up until till 2010, most everybody in the area referred to them as cru, a French term. Many people still do. They were not really a cru in any of the French terms, which either mean a town or a growth, like a canteen, a winery that are kind of rated. What they really meant is a vineyard site, like a lieu dit, they would say in French, a named place. And these were named places that were typically used to grow grapes, but not even necessarily every place in this rural mosaic had a name. So these were spontaneous names that were given to identifiable places in the rural area there, identifiable places where you could see that there was a vineyard. What distinguished one from the other? Some kind of a geographical figuration, a ravine or a forest or something like that. So the big problem was after the beginning in the 1960s, mid and late 1960s, and then into the 70s, people were starting to use these names regularly on labels that were marketed. Some of them were very highly regarded, but they were never registered. They were never really officially delineated. It was creating a lot of confusion. So they had to rectify that, they felt, in 2010. So they changed. So they created this term MGA, which stands for Menzioni Geografiche Aggiuntive, plural. Additional geographic mentions. And what it really is a labeling thing. You're determining what exactly is the area required for the grapes in order to use that name on the label. There are right now 101 MGAs in Barolo, and they consist of individual vineyard sites, which is what the crew originally were, larger areas where, and this is where it gets a little controversial. In many cases, they just merged together a lot of named vineyards because the names were not really being used. They thought it was too complicated mapping. And for example, this area here is now called Busia, but that area stretches from Castelnifolletto here, the boundary, all the way up to the village of Monforte, a huge area that the original Busia stopped right here. So there, it actually, I think it confuses things because Busia doesn't mean anything anymore unless you know exactly where in the Busia the wine came from. And they also introduced MGAs that are towns. So any one of the 11 villages of Barolo can make, there's an MGA for each name of the town. If all the grapes come from one of the towns, could be multiple vineyards from within a town, you can use that name, name of the town on the label. So it's good that it was created. They didn't always make the best choices, I think, but there you have it. Okay, getting into the MGAs, we have a number of them. Sorry for going a little bit over, but so Conterno Fantino is up in Monforte. It's a fairly new winery. These were Claudio Conterno and Guido Fantino were two friends who were coming from wine growing families who decided to get together and do their own winery. And they were like, you know, in this group of the so-called Barolo boys, and they're really a new generation kind of coming in and taking over well, actually they created their own winery. Their parents probably wouldn't let them do what they wanted to do. They work with about 27 hectares and produce about 140,000 bottles a year. They do spontaneous fermentation, meaning they don't inoculate, they don't add yeast and sugar into the must in order to initiate and control the fermentation process. And they make, very interesting, they make two wines from the same MGA, Ginestra in Monforte, this is on the Cervalian side, from two distinct vineyard sites. So very interesting, and both of them are there in the Classico portfolio. So you have Vigna Sori Ginestra, which is located in the Ginestra MGA, from vines planted in 1978. So vines that are getting to be quite old. Look at the makeup of sand, of soil: 50% sand, 34% silt, 16% clay, compared to the Ginestra de Vigna del Gris, another vineyard site, which was planted. The oldest plantings are 1971, and then two subsequent plantings, but still vines that are getting quite old. A little bit less sand, a little bit more silt, and there's also a difference in altitude here, which makes a difference as well. So, and here we're getting really down into nuance. Same producer, same menzione, same geographical area. Ginestra, this was considered to be a cru, and these are two separate vineyards within that MGA. And here you can see them. This is the Vigna Sori Ginestra, and there, a little bit higher altitude, is the Vigna del Gris. Einaudi, as I mentioned, is based in Dogliani very much. An old winery created in 1897 in the farmhouse of San Giacomo in Dogliani. Created a winery in 1915. They started to produce actually the Dolcetto appellation. Dolcetto di Dogliani was raised from a Dolcetto di Dogliani DOC to a DOCG appellation named just Dogliani, as we mentioned. They purchased 2 parcels in the vineyard of Kanubi, this iconic vineyard site, in 1997, which is important. They purchased additional vineyards in Verduno, the Monviliero vineyard, one of the really the most prestigious crews, certainly at Verduno, and one of the classic growing areas of the Barolo area. And here's one of them, the Terlo. This was the first vineyard that Luigi Einaudi purchased in the Barolo area in 1958. And the story behind that is they were established winery by then, very highly regarded. And Luigi Einaudi was also a president of the Republic of Italy, so he was an important person in Piemonte and for the entire country. He would have a lot of people over for supper. They would be drinking the wine and having a great time, but they would say, "Why don't you have any Barolo?" So he felt he says he felt kind of bad, and that compelled him to purchase a vineyard in Barolo in 1958, and it is this Terlo vineyard, which is a great vineyard, classic Tortonian soil, faces to the east, as is typical. That's what it looks like. I'm not sure where their parcels are exactly. But I think they're in the sort of the mid section. And then there is another vineyard that they purchased quite recently in 2016 in an area of the Busia, so they can call it the Busia MGA. Dardi is a subzone, and this was part, I have to say, it's part of the original Busia area. They don't mention where it comes from, the Busia. I had to actually reach out to them and find out where in the Busia their Barolo Busia comes from. And it's from the Dardi area that I know very well, not because it sounds like my name, but it is part of the classic Busia area. And typical Sedivalian soil, big structure. These wines are all aged in large casks, but here too is another great comparison of Sedivalian versus Tortonian soil. Western exposure. Let's see. There it is. Vineyards that look towards the west compared to those that look towards the east, and they're almost looking right at each other. And this, so after Dardi and Piempolvere, that's where Busia stopped. Now it's much larger than it was, for better or worse. The name Busia. And there's the Dardi. Okay, Cordero de Montezemolo. They trace their origins way back to the 1300s, probably in Spain. They settled in Piedmont in the 1400s, which is still quite a while ago. There is some intermingling with the family of the Faletti in Barolo. Nowadays, it's run by Father Giovanni. However, he's really transferring a lot of the work and the managing of the estate over to his son Alberto and daughter Elena. This is a unique winery, certainly as an estate. They own more vineyard land, but the Monfoletto estate is a contiguous estate of 28 hectares. That's very unusual. It's in the frazione, the hamlet of Annunziata and Namora, where there are a lot of really excellent vineyards. And now they have 51 hectares, which is a very respectable amount of territory in the Langhe area. And you see here, let me go back a second. This is the Monfoletto estate with a number of vineyards surrounding it. And this is where we'll see them in a second. This is their estate. The cedar tree is a very distinctive feature of the Langhe area. I read about it a bit in my book as kind of places that really stand out on the horizon. They make a few different wines, two MGAs in the classical portfolio. One of them is Gattara, which Gattara we looked at in the photograph just before. It's one parcel, and the highest that they make the MGA bottled wine from one parcel in the highest part of Gatera vineyard. The soil here is very fertile. It has a lot of clay in it, but it's this sort of Tortonian soil, a little bit less, younger, fresher a bit, although we're talking millions of years old. They do the maturation in French barriques. And, it's basically east looking, but there's southeast, there's east, and then there's even a little bit of northeast, but they probably don't use that vine grapes from that section for this bottling. Then there is another MGA that they make. They call Enrico VI, but it's really part of a very prestigious vineyard called Villero, which is in Casanifoletto. It's that yellow area there. Their vineyard is in the eastern part of that, on the higher part of the vineyard. They have a 2 hectare parcel there. So here it's Cervalian soil. It's more compact. There's more limestone in it, and it looks towards the west, southwest. And this one gets about 20 months in French, small French barrels. And they've had this 2 hectare parcel since 1965. Then there's a wine from the Monfoletto estate. Now this one, technically it would be considered a classic Barolo. It's made from different, it's not made from a single MGA or single vineyard, but it's made from different parcels with different exposures on their Monfoletto estate. So it's not an MGA, but it's like an estate bottling. And here you have a sort of micro blend from within that single estate. Then we get to our friends, Monchiero, Fratelli Monchiero, important here because there are other Monchiero wine producing families in the area. They were originally from this branch of the Monchiero family, originally from the Santa Maria area of La Mora. They came across the valley to Casanifoletto in 1954 to work as sharecroppers on the estate of Montanello. And that is where Vittorio, the son of the founder of this Monchiero winery, was born. His father and his father's brother, they discontinued sharecropping in the area, started to phase it out around the 60s, and in 1968 it was still going. But they went and established their own winery in Castiglione in 1972. And they have 11 hectares and produce about 70,000 liters of wine. And we use liters here because about 30% of that is sold in bulk. So they produce about 40,000 bottles now. They could produce more, but they still sell a certain amount of their wine in bulk. And that gives them the possibility of choosing the best wine from the best grapes to use for their wines. Interestingly, in 2005, Monchiero purchased a vineyard in the Montanello area. And so now they're making a single area Barolo, I can't say single vineyard anymore, single vineyard Barolo from their area of Montanella. And their first one was in 2010. So, and once again, you see two very different vineyards from the same town by the same producer. Montanello is over here. It faces, it's on the right side of the road as you're driving up. It faces towards the southwest. And this is one of those vineyards that has a very kind of long, generous descent to the valley in the bottom. The soil, however, is Cervalian with a lot of calcareous marl and some compressed sand there as well. And they chose to from the Montanello, they only do a reserve version, which requires 5 years of aging with at least 3 in wood, and they only use large casks for their Barolos. There you see that. And the other Barolo we have here is from the Roque vineyard of Casanifoletto. one I know very well, and one that is also really one of these legendary iconic crus. Now, this one, unlike many of the others, was really prized for its delicacy and finesse, very distinct aroma. And for that reason, before, when people were making wines there were blends of Nebbiolo grapes from different areas, they would always pay a high price for this one because of its aroma and finesse and character, even if it was a little bit paler and a little bit lighter in alcohol, which is usually how they were paying a premium for wines that were high in alcohol and dark in color, because those are things that Nebbiolo didn't have back then. But this had something else, and it still does. This is very distinctive. It's a vineyard that sits on a cliff facing to the south, to the southeast. Very shallow soil. Underneath the shallow soil, there's rock, and the vines have to go into cracks in the rock to find moisture. It can really have a hard time in vintages that are very dry because the soil does not retain water. But this has always been a very distinctive vineyard, and it was one of the very first vineyards to be bottled as a single vineyard wine around early 1960s. One of the first was Alfredo Corrado from Vieti. And there it is. You can see very, very steep, very dramatic. It just goes straight down from the road facing southeast. Then I think this is our last Maccarini in La Morra. They have about 25 hectares of vineyard. Brunate is another one of the classic Barolo crus that were on Renato Ratti's initial map. They have about a 4.5 hectare parcel at about 300 meters above sea level. And once again, this is a southeast facing vineyard with Tortonian soil. It overlaps the boundaries of Barolo and La Morra, their vineyard site. Once again, classic Tortonian soil. They acquired the vineyard in 1958, and the vines are fairly old. They use 2 years, typical 2 years of aging in large casks, 2,000 to 4,000 liters, and another year in bottle. And there it is, right over there. Oh, a few more, actually, sorry. Viberti is located, as I mentioned, in the hamlet of Vernier in the town of Barolo. It began as a locanda, a hotel. They started to serve food there. Antonio Viberti acquired it in 1923 with some land surrounding it, and he created a small winery in one of the buildings, and they started making wine to serve in the restaurant in this very kind of the traditional restaurant, very rustic in this inn. And it was kind of a rough and tumble inn, you can see. Started bottling it and selling it commercially in 1955. Now it's, the generations are moving on. His son, Giovanni, took it over in the 70s and 80s. And now there's a third generation, Claudio, who's really overseeing the vineyards in Cantina. And they've acquired a lot more properties all over the Barolo area. They currently produce about 130,000 bottles from 28 hectares of vineyards. And the one we're looking at here is located right up in Vernier. This is one of their earliest acquisitions. It's a Reserva bottling, quite high, about 400 to 500 meters above sea level, which gives it this freshness and minerality along with the Tortonian soil. They have, this is really interesting. They have 4 different vineyards in the Brico delle Viole site. There they are. You can see the darkened vineyards there. And they don't use all of them as the MGA bottling. They do some of that, but a lot of it goes into the Barolo Buon Padre, which is really their most important wine in many different ways. And they do most of their aging, requires at least 2 years in wood, remember. They use upright barrels, untoasted, which are called tini. They're kind of conical barrels for this maturation period, which is a traditional type of container used. So wow, that was it. Sorry, a lot of information there. Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, yes, I do, Alan. So the one that was lighter was Roche di Castiglione Falletto. That was the one lighter in alcohol and more.
Well, that's what it was. That's what it was prized for. That's what it was famous for back, before single bottling wines, and certainly before the creation of this MGA system.
So if I go,
yeah,
if I go to the store and I ask for that, will they know what I'm talking about? For what?
Yes, no, I mean, not every store will carry it. I'm sure you could find out from Classical Wine what retail stores in your area have it, how you could obtain it. Roque is it's one of these single vineyard bottlings, and there are about 8 producers that do a single bottling Barolo from the Roque vineyard. So you could look for that, and and if you have, if you want, if you could compare that, if you get the Roque Barolo from Monchiero or any other one you can find, if you compare that to another one of the vineyards that are on the other side, you can even do it on the other side of the road. Villero or Enrico VI is right on the other side of Roque, but it gives completely different wines. And Villero is big. I think there are 15 people that bottle a Villero Barolo bottling. So these names, they really do mean something. And I mean, things have changed a little bit since the Roque vineyard developed its reputation. And we have to say Roque di Castiglione because there are many other vineyards named Roque. One of the best known ones of them is Roque dell'Annunziata, which is another great vineyard.
Oh, Annunziata, okay. I've seen that one.
So, but they're different. Roque is just a name for cliff. So here, okay, it's really the Roque di Castiglione that is different. And once again, I'm not saying that every Roque bottling from every Barolo from the Roque vineyard would. Well, it does have those inherent characteristics. I mean, I once years ago I wrote an article on the Roque vineyard for what was then Sommelier Journal, tasting and comparing the 8 or 9 single vineyard bottlings from that vineyard, and very different styles. There were some producers who were going for more body and intensity, and you can do that by doing certain things, doing a very low yield of grapes from the vineyard, doing a long maceration, even with a little bit higher temperature to extract more color. Some people were even doing things that were not legal. You putting other grape varieties that are darker, like Barbera, typical blend. Maybe there were even grapevines that were planted in vineyards of Nebbiolo, like Barbera. There's another one, Neretto. It means darker, black. It produced darker grapes, and they would typically plant them in vineyards of Nebbiolo to give a little bit more color. So I mean, there are ways of manipulating that. Just like even from what we call a lighter sort of environment, like a Tortonian environment, you have somebody like Roberto Voerzio, who does extremely low yields of 500, like 500 kilograms, so half a kilo, a pound per plant, and from some of the vineyards in La Morra, gets vines that are incredibly concentrated and colored and dense. He manages to do it with amazing balance. So they have that darkness and intensity, but they have the freshness and the varietal character and the acidity and the tannin to balance it out. And it's counterintuitive, but he can do it. So I'm just saying that you can analyze what the characteristics of a given vineyard site, and then they can be manipulated or expressed in different ways by different producers, and that's how it should be. The important thing is to make a good wine.
Thank you.
Question regarding the Langhe Nebbiolo, 85% Nebbiolo and blended the rest. How long will be like that? I mean, is a long time they do that, or?
Yeah, from the very beginning.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to remember that is the regulation for Lange DOC.
Yeah, okay, just line, okay.
But I mean, you can always go beyond the minimum requirements. And certainly that's for the Lange. If you find a Lange Nebbiolo that comes from outside the Barolo zone,
Yeah.
Maybe they put something else. Maybe they blend it with something else, and it doesn't have to be a bad blend. I actually tasted a wine recently. It's not even a DOC. I don't think it was a DOC. It was just a I don't know what I think it wasn't an EGT. It can't be, but it was a blend of it was from Asti. It was a blend of Barbera and Rouquet. So I mean, you can do these other types of blends. They can be very good. Most producers in the Barolo area who make a Lange Nebbiolo, Lange Nebbiolo in the Barolo area is like a Rossi di Montalcino,
Okay.
or a Rosso di Brunello. I'm sorry, Rosso di Montalcino or Rosso di Vino Nobile.
Rosso Toscano. Okay.
No, it's different because a Rosso di Montalcino or a Rosso di Vino di Montepulciano is like a baby Brunello or a baby Vino Nobile.
Yeah, Brunello Gentile. Yeah.
For most producers in the Barolo area who make a Lange DOC, they're making a baby Barolo. So they might use their younger grapes, or maybe they might declassify. What they usually do is a single vineyard wine, and declassify it because maybe the vintage didn't work that well. So they don't want to. Maybe it's not the Barolo standards. Maybe it's not going to really benefit from 3 years minimum of aging. So they'll make a great Lange Nebbiolo, 100%. It's just
Lange Nebbiolo, but they don't call 100% Barolo like, the regular Barolo. They cannot call Lange Barolo Riserva, example, no.
Yes,
No way.
Barolo has to be 100% Nebbiolo, and
Nebbiolo, yeah,
like
right.
Barbaresco.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying, however, is even though Lange Nebbiolo only requires a minimum of 85%, most producers in the Barolo area that produce a Lange Nebbiolo, it's 100%. Because that's what they have. I mean,
yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank everybody so
Dario?
much. I'm sorry if it took a lot of time, but there's a lot of material there.
That's okay.
Oh, Alan, thank you very much. As always, it's great that you're a wealth of information, so we really appreciate it. No, I guess everybody's good. So
I'll send out the link once it gets uploaded.
Great.
perfect.
Yes,
And
sir. Next week is Toscana.
wonderful. Look forward to that. Really
That's what, a
appreciate it,
3-hour
man.
session?
No, I'm gonna a lot of things there, but there's not, maybe not quite as much. Well, there's a little bit of history that's important. It's not just about history. It's about how does it impact on the tradition of wine growing and producing in that area. That's really the important thing. But it won't be so long, I promise.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Alan, thank you again. I look forward to see you next Saturday. And
Thanks,
thanks
everyone.
again, everybody, for joining in. Really appreciate it.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Have a
much.
great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.